Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch with League. My name is Roma Dawson and I serve on the board of the League of Women Voters of San Jose, Santa Clara, a nonpartisan political organization that also covers the cities of Milpitas, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy. Our purpose is to encourage informed and active participation in government and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Each month, we host a speaker who can share with us information and ideas that will help broaden our understanding of issues in our community. This month, we are so very excited to welcome Cameron Hickey, Project Director for Algorithmic Transparency at the National Conference on Citizenship. I attended Cameron's workshop at the National League Convention in June, and it was one of the best. We are so pleased that he's willing to share his expertise with us at a local league event. Cameron was formerly a research fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. As a fellow, he investigated the spread of mis- and disinformation on social media through the development of tools to identify and analyze problematic content. Previously, Cameron covered science and technology for the PBS NewsHour and Nova. He has won a News and Documentary Emmy Award and a Newhouse Mirror Award for his journalism. He was also a Knight Foundation prototype grantee for his junk news monitoring tool, News Tracker. After Cameron's initial presentation, we'll have time for questions, so please send them through chat as they occur to you. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Cameron Hickey. Cameron.
Thank you, Roma, and thank you to all of you who took the time out of your day to join and to listen to what I think is some really crucial information about how we think about protecting our democracy. I'm really proud and honored to get to present to members of the League all across the country. I've been doing so extensively over the last week to folks in various state leagues, and so I'm really thrilled to be joining all of you in California today. Let me just share my screen and I'm going to dive in and get started. I run the Algorithmic Transparency Institute. We build tools to investigate mis and disinformation on social media, and we run campaigns and help support partners like the League in running campaigns to try and tackle the challenge of mis and disinformation. I'm here to talk to you today about building resilience to mis and disinformation, and I want to walk you through the various parts of this that I think are important. So let's get started. First and foremost, it's critical to recognize that misinformation, particularly that which is spreading on social media, has become a fact of life. It fuels polarization and hate. It drives down trust in our institutions. It amplifies fringe science and conspiracy theories, and it incites violence. Every single political and social issue that we hope to address is now impacted by the threat of false and misleading claims that can confuse and radicalize the public. This is a significant challenge. This is not just one of the challenges that we need to face. It is one that is infused in all of the other topics that we're trying to tackle. It is pervasive now. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. Now, I'd like to believe that everyone who's on this call today recognizes that what that expression silver bullet means, but I was told in a previous presentation that some people did not know, so I will be clear. Silver bullet is an expression that refers to like a way to kill, I think, either a vampire or a werewolf or something. It's the one solution to solve them all, or a panacea. And so my point here in putting this on the screen is to say, unfortunately, this problem is really big, and there is no one simple solution to it, right? Social media platforms and fact checkers are not going to moderate us out of this problem, right? They're not going to solve it. No single act of Congress is going to restrict this flood of mis and disinformation that is just going to continue to flow no matter what. However, if we build capacity within our communities to establish resilience to the impact of mis and disinformation, we can make a difference. If we cultivate a shared sense of our civic responsibility for understanding and identifying the harmful and misleading messages that are spreading, and then we invest energy in constructively engaging with one another, we can build the bridges and find the common ground that are necessary to actually engage in what the Surgeon General of the United States has called a whole of society effort to address this problem and to improve our discourse. So I want to talk briefly about what that means. What is a whole of society effort for tackling this problem, right? First, it means acknowledging that we all share a responsibility, what I just said. But going beyond that, it means these three key points that I put up on the screen. First, it means recognizing that, or I should say, it means embracing that everyone can be affected by mis and disinformation, regardless of our political perspective. This is not a left, right, blue, red problem. We are all impacted. Mis and disinformation affects all of us. We're all susceptible. So we have to accept and acknowledge that first. Then we need to recognize that misinformation looks different in each community, and we need to tackle it everywhere, not just in white English-speaking spaces, right? Much of the attention paid to mis and disinformation is focused on majority communities and mainstream English language concerns. But to meaningfully tackle misinformation for our entire society, we actually have to make a specific effort to address the unique ways that it spreads in marginalized communities, and be aware that the substance can be quite different in those places, and that those kinds of communities are frequently targeted by disinformation. Finally, it means that striving to ensure that the messages and strategies that are used to counteract these problems are generated by the people and in the places that they're supposed to address. Effective community outreach and communications must be authentic, must be informed by the unique circumstances that are facing a particular community. So effectively combating the challenges posed by mis and disinformation means that the solutions can't be imposed from the outside. Instead, we have to empower the folks within the communities to develop approaches that'll resonate with them so that they're invested in the outcome and so that they're able to tailor the approach based on their own unique cultural knowledge. So this is how we think about a whole of society effort. I said a lot of words, but the simplest way to think about it is it must be inclusive and it must be empowering. Now I want to talk about what is this stuff, right? There's a lot of different terms that we use, whether we're talking about misinformation or disinformation, junk news, rumors, conspiracy theories, hate speech, whatever it is all harmful. It can all create a problem. There are a lot of different definitions that go with these terms, and people often ask, what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation? We can have that conversation in greater detail, but the reality is all of these forms are harmful, and we need to be vigilant about and attempt to address all of them. And most important in my mind is acknowledging that this issue is much bigger and more complicated than a simple distinction between lies and truth, right? I want to pause here for a minute and let everyone reckon with that, right? It is not as simple as that stuff is false and I've got the facts, right? There are some cases where that's true, but what we see in our research and what I want you to take home today is the idea that the big problem is in this gray area in between, which is where lots of rumors circulate, which is where lots of the challenges I'm about to talk about, the specific tactics emerge. And so starting with that acknowledgement is really critical. Now I want to talk today about some key tactics that are part of this gray area. I think it's really important to establish what each of these are. Because the time is limited, it's just lunchtime for you guys, I'm not going to dive into concrete and specific examples of each of these tactics, but I will make sure you all have access to a much longer presentation and recording where you can look at specific examples and learn a little bit more about each of these in particular. But let's dive in, right? As I said, we need to acknowledge that the kinds of messages that corrupt our discourse are not always the simple and obvious examples of what we used to call fake news or lies, right? Beyond the outright falsehoods, the key areas of concern include messages that lack critical context. Things like articles, statistics, charts, or even images that lack a critical piece of information might end up being incredibly misleading. We put all this stuff together under the label missing context, right? Without that context, it's just as wrong and likely as harmful as the stuff that's completely made up. We also see a lot of arguments that are based on a faulty or illogical premise, something that can't be proven wrong, but nonetheless is not right. This is a common tactic in political rhetoric and propaganda, but we also see it cropping up frequently online in image-based memes and short-form videos. When someone sets up a straw man to tear them down, right? They invent an issue that they then say this issue is wrong, or when you try to falsely compare things that just are not comparable, doing that corrupts our ability to actually build a constructive and honest discourse, right? So anytime someone's employing a faulty logical premise, that's a clue to us that the underlying message here, the conclusion they're trying to get us to draw, may itself be problematic. Beyond these, and I should just say, missing context and faulty logic, these are the most common forms of what we call problematic content that appear on social media. But in addition, I want to talk about these other three because they're often insidious, dangerous, harmful, and problematic as well. And I'm sure you've all encountered them in some cases, right? So we constantly see coded messages that are embedded with stereotypes and hate, right? They can be, they can use innuendo, they can use jokes, right? They can be, again, like, social media memes that skirt the edge. They don't really use horrible language. Like when we talk about hate speech, we think about really vile content, but hateful content and dog whistles that can come in many different forms. And it's really important to acknowledge that every overt and covert expression of prejudice, it's founded on a kernel of misinformation. Hate speech is disinformation. Now, I wish I didn't have to talk about conspiracy theories, but we're in this place now where we do, right? They have been around forever. But in the last few years, we've seen a massive rise in their prevalence and diversity across social media. At their core, I think it's important to think about conspiracy theories serving a role similar to mythology, right? It's a story, it's an idea that gives us a kind of fantastic or an exciting answer to difficult and confusing challenges that impact our lives. When we can't believe that our candidate didn't win, it just seems impossible to us, or we can't understand how the entire world shut down in a matter of weeks due to an invisible plague. Instead, blaming powerful people with ulterior motives, as opposed to looking for more, complicated or nuanced answers, that gives us the opportunity to, blame something on a story that matches like the sort of fantastic scale of our frustration and confusion. So conspiracy theories offer us kind of like this way out that offsets the responsibility to someone else, and it really is grand and fantastic. So recognizing when we see those things is critically important. Finally, and this one is a little bit simpler, but it's also one to be really vigilant about. Content that may be, legitimate in its original context, true, come from a reliable source, but is originally from several years ago, when we see it getting reshared or rediscussed today, out of that context in which it was originally written or published, that content can become just as misleading, even though it's true, as stuff that was totally made up again. And that's because in today's context, that news may no longer be relevant, or there may be other information that we need that's not contained in that old report. So recognizing and being vigilant about old content is critically important. So now we've talked about the tactics for mis and disinformation that we see most commonly appearing, the tactics for problematic content. But why does it work? Why does it resonate with us? Why are we duped by it, or why are we persuaded by it? It's critical to think about this. It helps us to recognize how those tactics might be manipulating us, and then be vigilant for them as well and take a step back. So first, I want to talk about motivated reasoning. We are predisposed to believe ideas that align with our political beliefs and our social values. When we learn that someone we don't trust or agree with may have done something bad, we're less likely to question the evidence because we already expect them to be guilty. These same biases can get us into trouble because they can condition us to rationalize or ignore evidence when things don't align with our views. Whenever we evaluate what we're reading and hearing, we need to pay particular attention to whether or not a message is playing to these biases as we look for and judge the evidence to support the idea. I think about it like this: just because we want something to be true does not mean that it is. Another critical means by which disinformation sticks is through emotional appeals, right? Misleading messages often strike a powerful emotional chord with us. Usually they make us angry or fearful, but sometimes they could also make us happy or proud. Anytime we encounter a message that triggers a strong emotional response, we have to take a step back. We have to consider why this message makes us feel that way and question whether or not these emotions might risk clouding our critical thinking skills. I often think it's important to say, when something makes us angry in whatever circumstance, like it's important to take a breath, take a beat, right? That's good advice for your health in general. In the context of mis and disinformation and the messages that we receive, in particular about, electoral politics, for example, questioning those messages when they make us angry, taking that opportunity to take a beat can be especially important because it gives us a window to say, actually, this thing is just playing to my emotions. It's not really legitimate once you dig a little bit deeper, and I need to take a pass on this. And this, I think, is a particularly valuable one when you try to communicate with others. And I'll talk a little bit later about structured conversations and ways to have communications with others. Lastly, and I want to talk very briefly about the concept of easy answers. Frequently, as I put in this illustration, when something comes gift wrapped, perfectly with a bow on top as an idea, like that's another opportunity where we might not be paying very close attention. Oh, this perfectly answers all of my questions exactly the way they need to. That answer, sometimes when something is too good to be true, it probably is. And so we need to be skeptical of easy answers, especially when they trade in some of those other tactics, right? So I would just mention these three different tactics: motivated reasoning, emotional appeals, and easy answers. It's important to recognize they don't appear mutually exclusively, right? Often they can appear all in the same message. So an emotional appeal can be made to make an easy answer easier to digest, right? Motivated reasoning to appeal to our biases can be potent because it deals with a topic that makes us angry. So thinking about these tactics, especially or these appeals, and thinking about how they appear together, and thinking about how when you see one, looking for some of the others can be very helpful in trying to distinguish between messages that you should take seriously and messages that you should either dismiss or work on combating or responding to. Now, finally, in this section of sort of defining what we're talking about, I want to talk briefly about some cases where we can discern the motive behind why certain people create disinformation. Often we can't figure out the motive, and I want to acknowledge that first, right? There are many cases where a message is being spread and we don't have any idea why. We can't pinpoint it. But in some cases we can, and when we can, recognizing that is valuable both for ourselves in detecting the strategies, and again, as we think to communicate to others, because pointing at, drawing out, identifying the motivations when they're visible is useful to help someone else reason for themselves about why something might be misleading. So first and foremost, many bad actors are driven by a political agenda. This should seem obvious, right? They spread falsehoods and use all the tactics I mentioned earlier in service of a mission to achieve policy and electoral goals, right? They want to elect candidates, pass laws, or shift public opinion towards the causes they support. We generally assume this is the dominant motive in a lot of the corrosive content we see online. However, a large proportion of those who perpetuate conspiracies, invent and distribute false information, and sow doubt and confusion are actually driven by profit. We often see these messages appear in support of like direct fundraising appeals, right? So here's something bad, now give me some money. We also see them, to help amplify and support product sales, right? Whether it's t-shirts or vitamin supplements or all kinds of other things, actually generating revenue from product sales is a motivation for spreading mis and disinformation. And then we also see a ton of effort to drive traffic, right? Audience for advertising. Lots of hyper-partisan misleading content on social media is done so that it drives clicks to generate ad revenue. This challenge is growing, and it's often very easy to detect when you see profit motive indicators surrounding content, especially when you see it online, to recognize actually this is about the profit, not about the substance. Finally, and I want to talk about this is much more rare, but it's very important that we pay attention to the cases where it's happening. There are a subset of bad actors who are motivated by the enjoyment they derive from generating disinformation. They operate as sort of like chaos agents. They take pleasure in spreading conspiracy theories, and hate in particular, because it gets them attention and it gives them an outlet possibly for their own frustrations with society, right? Their point is to instigate us to respond, to provoke us. And the act of responding in these cases is serving their interests, not ours. So being cognizant of and resistant to those provocations is critically important. And thinking critically about something that makes us so angry, we're so distraught or upset by something someone would say, if in the end, the only point was to get us to respond, to get us to amplify their message, or to get us to be angry, we need to avoid that risk. So I want to just recap. I've now summarized, this is what the problem looks like, right? The problem comes in many forms. It lives in the gray area between truth and lies. It appeals to our biases, our emotions, and our desire for easy answers. And politics, profit, and pranks are what motivate people to create it. I want to add one more line here to the bottom of what I define as the problem, and that is, if we are not careful, we can accidentally contribute to the spread, right? Recognizing that part of this problem is that we all have the potential to amplify and contribute to it rather than diminish it. So acknowledging that and being vigilant about that is critical as well. So now I want to shift gears and talk about what are some strategies for action. And I want to start by reiterating this first rule. In general, the rule is do not engage, right? Hopefully at this point, based on all the other things that I mentioned, there are some obvious reasons why do not engage is the primary rule. You don't want to get provoked. You don't want to amplify false and misleading content. You don't want to risk participating in things, but I'll talk about some other specifics in just a minute. But that is always our first rule. However, with all rules, there's some exceptions. So I want to talk briefly about when to consider engaging. What are the criteria by which you might consider this is different, and I can ignore the do not engage rule and instead think about whether to engage on something. And then if you've met that criteria, what are some counter messaging strategies? And then finally, I want to talk about the concept of structured conversations and how to think about actually engaging, particularly face-to-face with folks. So I put this slide up here just to reiterate it. When in doubt, do not engage, right? This is the starting point. Now let's talk about why we do not want to engage, right? The risks and obstacles are often far outweigh any perceived benefits, right? There's a personal toll you can experience if there's backlash against you. There's social consequences that you can't always predict. And critically, in some cases, your effort to respond can have the opposite of the intended effect and increase the reach and reinforce the potency of the falsehood you're trying to address. In particular, you want to avoid some common mistakes that we all have a tendency to make. You do not want to argue. When you argue directly with someone and you try to contradict them, they usually respond with defensiveness. They get pushed deeper into their own corner and more fiercely defend the fallacy. This can have the adverse effect of actually increasing their belief in the misleading concept. Sometimes your disagreement can be perceived as evidence of the legitimacy of whatever rumor they believe. Online in particular, any form of interaction with a falsehood can serve to amplify it. We do not want to amplify mis and disinformation. The systems on social media platforms that choose what content to recommend to people often disregard the difference between positive and negative engagement. I know I'm talking to a bunch of people in Silicon Valley, so I'm sure you're all quite familiar with these ideas. They originate, right down the road from you. The challenge here is being aware that any message you send to the platform can boost a piece of content, and you need to acknowledge that the last thing you want to do is help more people see something that they wouldn't have otherwise seen when what you were trying to do is squash or debunk it. Unfortunately, this is often how we become the unintentional spreaders of misinformation, even when we're trying to do something good. I want to talk about this one in particular because it's critically important as we move towards, 2022's election day. We do not want to repeat the language of the falsehood. When you attempt to talk about misleading ideas, disinformation, or conspiracy theories, it is often challenging to do so without using the language of the people who created it. It's critical to avoid allowing a disinformer to define the terms. When they do, you cannot repeat them, and you you risk letting them control the terms of the conversation. It's especially important when it comes to terminology used around the safety and integrity of our elections. You should not repeat the language used by those who seek to undermine the legitimacy of the democratic process, because their effort to define and repeat those terms is also an effort to normalize the misleading and harmful ideas. Simply put, language has power. We should not cede that power by using the terminology that's been created by the disinformers. Finally, I want to point this one out because I myself struggle with this, in many occasions. When you interact with someone in real life or online, you need to avoid using words or approaches that would seek to or have the effect of embarrassing or ridiculing them. It's the same as arguing, essentially, but in that it usually has the opposite of the intended effect. While you may be frustrated or even shocked that someone else might believe something that you feel is absurd or stupid, I know I feel this, you cannot convince them otherwise by making them feel bad. And instead, again, your effort's more likely to backfire, reinforce their beliefs, and make you an enemy at the same time. We can't say this enough. Ridiculing and derogatory language is not productive, and we have to suppress our urges and our tendencies to use that language in all of our interactions. I want to pause here for a minute, and I put this big red banner on the screen to talk briefly about response strategies. Before responding, think carefully about the risks and be sure you have a plan to proceed. When in doubt, do not engage, do not respond. With that warning in place, let's talk briefly about some circumstances that are the exceptions to the do not engage rule. When should you consider engaging? The first and foremost is what we call a tipping point. When a rumor, a conspiracy theory, or some other type of problematic content has crossed a threshold where it's become well-known, widely discussed, or clearly is no longer isolated to a small community, we often think that that idea has crossed a tipping point. In many cases, we might want to quantify this using something like online engagement, right? That video has more than 1 million views. The real tipping point depends, right? Depends on the community, the potential reach of the topic. So deciding when something has crossed a tipping point, it's subjective. You've got to decide. However, a good way to think about the tipping point is, can this narrative, can this idea or this message no longer be contained? If so, it likely deserves a response. You can think about it like this. If a piece of content is circulating widely on multiple social media platforms, or if an idea is generating news coverage in mainstream news, or if it's being discussed frequently across multiple conversations within your community, then it might have crossed that tipping point. Next, I want to talk about this idea of data deficits. And I think this is actually one of the most important ones, and we'll talk about it again in a minute when we think about the actual response messaging. When a particular piece of misinformation demonstrates a gap in knowledge, some other question that lingers unanswered, we think of that as a data deficit, right? So sometimes we can talk about this as like when there's legitimate demand for information, but when you search for it, you only find low quality information online. It doesn't have to be online, right? It's in any context. If you can identify a clear data deficit that's exposed by the rumor or the misinformation or the conspiracy theory that you're seeing getting shared, then that represents a good opportunity for response. The goal here is to fill that deficit, to fill that void with good information, rather than repeating the falsehood. It's safer, it's more productive. There are numerous data deficits around how election security is maintained. It is those data deficits that have given rise to the range of misinformation and conspiracy theory narratives that are undermining confidence in our election system, right? So tackling those data deficits within your community can be key it can be a key focus really for meaningful engagement. And then finally, in some cases, you may find yourself in a situation where misinformation creates a concrete obstacle in the real world. Registering voters, right? Or assisting in folks' participation in the voting process at a particular moment in time are obvious examples, but there's likely others. In these situations, a falsehood may need to be addressed at that moment to actually overcome the obstacle. In circumstances like this, it's critical to recall the things that I just said about how not to engage, right? Avoiding arguments and embarrassing others. And actually think about how you can use structured conversations, which we'll talk about in a moment, to think about tackling that challenge in these situations. So now I want to talk about, if we've met that criteria, what does response look like? And I want to draw your attention to this concept of pre-bunking, right? So to debunk something in advance as a form of inoculation, right? A pre-bunk is a message that's designed to inoculate someone against a particular misinformation narrative or tactic so that they are more resilient to it, much in the same way that a vaccine would inoculate us against a virus, right? Helping people to develop this immunity to misinformation, it requires following some steps and being quite careful. You want to identify the thing you want to pre-bunk, you want to craft a meaningful message, and you want to communicate that a message in an effective way that avoids amplifying it. I will make sure that you guys all have access to share this. This is a list of 10 tips. It's sort of like a checklist for pre-bunking. Figure out what information people need and choose an example carefully. There's 5 steps to design a specific message that you would share, and I'll talk about that structure in a minute. And then think about how and where to share it. So keep it simple, make it shareable, and share it in the place where the people that need to hear it are going to hear it. But so you'll have this to look at, and you can use this checklist in a sense when you're trying to craft a message to think specifically about how to structure it and evaluate it. When you're trying to craft a message specifically, there is some general guidance, and this varies, in the ways that it gets employed, but I want to give you an opportunity to reckon with this general guidance about the structure of a pre-bunk counter message, right? It is wrapped in a fact. It begins with a fact, it ends with a fact, right? You want to lead with that fact, and you want to make it simple and plausible and important. There's a reason people need to know about it. Then you want to, as I did a little bit earlier, I paused and I gave you a break for a moment. You want to think about the idea of warning folks, right? Warn them that you're about to tell them something misleading. There is a dangerous myth that, right, is one way of thinking about that. But you want to then mention whatever you need to mention, using as few words as possible, only once, avoid to whatever extent you need to, or you are able to, in actually referencing it. And instead focus on explaining it. Explain how it misleads, explain the motivations behind folks, explain why it sticks, all of those other things that I talked about earlier. Explain what's wrong with the problem, with the message, rather than going to detail about the problem. Like, it's not about debunking the facts of it, but it's explaining why it's harmful and why it's dangerous. And then again, finishing off with the fact, reinforce the fact, push the more plausible explanation as the end of your message, right? So make sure whatever form of communication, online, offline, in person, digitally, that you use a structure that wraps your message in facts and is careful about how you communicate. Finally, I want to talk about structured conversations. So when circumstances permit, active and structured conversations can be a valuable approach to addressing misinformation within your community, particularly when there's more time and the possibility to engage face-to-face, right? A meaningful structured conversation, it starts with openness and a sincere effort to understand someone else's perspective. Begin by asking questions, right? Questions that help you learn what someone else believes and why those beliefs are important to them, right? Then you want to be able to show empathy, demonstrate that you understand what they're thinking, what they're feeling, show that you can be trusted, and establish the shared values you have and your honest desire to understand the fears that someone else has. As you delve into the specifics, maintain a focus on the motives of those who created the message, like we talked about earlier, rather than the person that you're speaking with, right? Direct their attention to the motives of others if you can, instead of thinking about why the individual that you're engaging with and being accusatory or demeaning to them directly. Be sure to share your own perspective in a way that describes your personal experience, right? So how did you learn what you learned? Why is it meaningful to you? Personalizing your communications rather than thinking about employing outside expertise is critically important. This structured conversation strategy, it builds on all the advice that we talked about in counter messaging, right? Effective structured conversations avoid arguments and demeaning language. They don't solely rely on the authority of outside voices like news organizations and fact checkers. While those ideas are really important, you want to use the messages that you get from news organizations and fact checkers to explain to someone in your own words how you build on something with your own personal experience. This approach is complicated. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't always work in the moment, but when you demonstrate respect and empathy as you communicate, you're more likely to build trust that has a lasting impact, right? So I have frequently experienced that this strategy does not change someone's mind, right? We can't expect that, but it gives them the opportunity to think about the issues that you're discussing and shift in the future their attention to some of the other reasons why they might believe something that they're believing, and it gives them the opportunity to think critically. So this non-confrontational approach can be incredibly valuable. I'm looking at the time here, and I want to be mindful of that and offer some opportunity for questions. So I'm going to briefly mention the last piece of this presentation, and then I will share some resources after the fact. The Algorithmic Transparency Institute, in collaboration with the League of Women Voters, as well as some other organizations like Common Cause and other advocacy organizations across the country, run a program that invites you, if you are interested, to learn a lot more about mis and disinformation, to work collaboratively to report examples of mis and disinformation that you find online or in your own community, and to submit them to a shared database that offers the opportunity for many others to make use of those insights for a variety of accountability efforts that are ongoing. So I will just pop ahead quite quickly to say, if you're interested in participating in other ways, there are two things that you can do right now. The first of those is, if you see mis and disinformation in your own social feed or out in the world in other contexts, you can report it to us and to the League of Women Voters. And you can do that starting as soon as today by pulling out your mobile phone right now and scanning this QR code. If you scan this QR code, your phone will ask you, would you like to add the League of Women Voters tip lines to your address book? If you do that, it'll essentially bookmark these phone numbers, this email address, and this website. And then the next time you encounter something that seems problematic to you, whether it's an outright falsehood or lie, like we've talked a little bit about, or all those other strategies that I mentioned, submit it to this system. The folks from the League of Women Voters US, all of our partners all across the country, as well as a wide range of researchers and other advocacy organizations focused on mis and disinformation, make use of those reports in getting situational awareness about what is happening across the country, and we help to facilitate engagement and response. The other thing that you can do is you can go to ati.io/sign-up if you're interested in learning more and joining the Civic Listening Corps. It's a volunteer opportunity to actually report examples of mis and disinformation on a regular basis. Sign up for shifts, get additional training, and do this work on an ongoing basis. We're doing that in collaboration with the League, and so we invite all of you to join us and learn more. And with that, I will pause to say thank you so much for having me and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Cameron, for the great overview. And I hope everybody can see me on screen as well now. There I am. Thank you very much. I had the great privilege of representing the San Jose, Santa Clara local in person at the National Convention in Denver. And I will tell you that the amount of buzz that this man generated was incredible. For the entire rest of the time, you would overhear conversations and you'd always hear, do not engage, do not engage. That is very difficult. And the other thing we heard was just how compatible your views are, the program you outlined for us today is with League values and the desire for all of us for civil discourse. So I would hope that you all continue to send questions in on chat. I'll do my best to monitor chat. We have a few folks that want to raise their hands and ask questions yourself. So do click raise hand and I'll do my very best to call on you. We did have some questions sent in advance by folks, and I want to honor the people that took time to call them in. And Cameron, the first one I'm going to start off with is very particular to California. We've got two propositions on the ballot, Prop 26 and 27. that relate to online gambling. And it's one of the most expensive campaigns ever in the history of California, over 300 and something million coming in. And voters have been bombarded with commercials and mailers on these for months. And the messages from proponents and opponents of both measures make claims that are in conflict with one another. It's incredibly confusing. So rather than get into the details of the two ballot measures, I hope you drill down just a little bit. How do we stop misinformation from like this from spreading?
So I think that one antidote to bad information can be good information, right? So trying to identify and distill, I am not intimately familiar with the issues in Prop 26 and 27. So I can't speak to the specifics of what's true and false. And in general, that's not my job anyway. But instead, looking at the messages that are being shared, thinking about the tactics and strategies that I described earlier and calling those out, right? Like if a message that's advertising in support of or in opposition to these bills is deploying, insanely, emotionally charged language, fear mongering in particular, like identifying that this is fear mongering and we need to actually separate that out from what the facts are in this case. I think the other issue is looking to reliable sources that help to explain the key points and those. So looking to news organizations and fact checkers to define what those things are, apprising us of those key points, and then hammering those home in all of the conversations that you have, right? So the issue is not really about the thing that these, misleading advertisements, for example, is trying to misdirect our attention to. Instead, it's really these issues and pointing out that they're often using tactics that are about misdirecting or about, playing to our emotions and our biases over rational logic.
Thank you. And just in terms of a follow-up, we had some questions that are asking for sources. If you want to name any specific publications, particularly those that might have multiple languages for a city like San Jose, which is a minority majority city. And also, are there any international publications that you might like to recommend? And I won't mention any, but a few are mentioned just for your opinion on that.
So, I think that this is not an easy question to answer, right? There are a wide range of legitimate news sources out there. There are means for vetting both news sources and vetting fact-checking organizations. In English and in Spanish, there are a large volume of fact-checking operations that I certainly recommend, right? From Snopes and factcheck.org. And then in Spanish, there's Factchequeado, which I think is doing a big US operation, as well as both of the major Spanish language broadcasters, Telemundo and Univision. Those organizations are in the business of doing fact checking. And so those are all responsible places to look for good information that explains bad information in particular. So that would be my starting point. Something that I didn't include in the presentation today that I think is really important to keep in mind is use the information that fact checkers provide to inform yourself, to help you understand it better, and use that to explain it to others. But don't just cite or reference the fact check, right? Use it to educate yourself and to think about what should I be communicating to others. It's less about the specific source to look for good information and more about leveraging the knowledge that you gain from that source. Whether, I think we're all pretty capable of identifying what major mainstream news sources are either at the state level or nationally. So it's more about looking to those, reputable news sources wherever they are. And I think the same is true for international.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to go into chat and check out some of those questions. And here's one, how do you determine if a meme is a falsehood?
So there are a lot of strategies that are part of what we call verification, right? So tactics that journalists and fact checkers learn. I would direct you to, and we'll make sure you have these resources, to First Draft News, which is a website that has extensive verification skills and strategies. My starting point in all of the training that we do about verification starts with one word that's also native to Silicon Valley. It's Google it, right? it's a little bit simplistic, but let me be more specific, right? When you see something that you have reason to be skeptical of, you need to take those words, you need to put quotes around them and stick them into Google and see what else comes out. And you need to not necessarily stop at the info box that floats to the top. You need to scan through a little bit. Frequently, when you're concerned or questioning something, there is other data about that out there, and maybe even references to it specifically. So like a great example of this in last year is there was a lot of misinformation circulating that was associated with statistics about COVID and vaccines. Lots of different bits. I won't mention a particular, rumor or falsehood, but frequently when they appeared with a statistic, that created something really useful, right? 63% of people X and some other word, putting that into a search engine pulls out a bunch of useful insights that get you a lot further than just looking at what's spread in a meme, right? So that's the number one strategy. But like that question covers a lot of different things. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. Recognizing, does it employ strategies? In particular, when it comes to memes, are they employing some kind of comparison, right? When two things are being compared or one thing is being related to another, that's a key clue to say, wait, are these things comparable? Am I getting misdirected?
Thank you. And actually, you just touched on it. We had a question also about COVID vaccine misinformation, and I think you just answered that one as well. Mm-hmm. And let me go to another question we have. And I have fortunately unfortunately an entire family in technology, and they're always telling me, don't go down the rabbit hole. We have a question. Should one just opt out of online platforms like Facebook and others?
Hallelujah. Yes. Are
you sure?
I think I have been asked this question many times by many news organizations. What's the solution to this problem, right? And I do think that actually recognizing that social media has sort of whatever the promise it had at one point in time, like has been at least balanced out or maybe even counterbalanced with a lot of the risks and harm, right? The negative emotional impact that it has on our life. We all got by just fine back before we had it, and there will always be value for it. But recognizing that it is creating the problem for us is something that's at the very least worth considering, right? If you're someone who likes to drink alcohol and you manage to take days or weeks away from ever drinking alcohol, you tend to not feel any worse, right? I think that the same is true about these social media platforms. You spend some time away from them and you recognize, I was doing just fine without them. That, is not advice I managed to, adhere to myself. So I acknowledge that it is difficult, but I definitely think it is worth actively considering.
Thank you for that answer. And now Monica would like to ask her question in person. So Monica, I'm going to unmute you now.
Thanks so much, Roma. Can you and Cameron hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. So just for some context, I direct a multi-stakeholder dialogue on this topic. I'm from a consensus building nonprofit called Convergence. And what we're trying to do is very intentionally convene people across sectors, across ideologies who would really normally not work together on this topic to see if we can forge consensus solutions. And Cameron, your emphasis on community level solutions and community resilience really resonates. I'm wondering if in order to bring some of these solutions to scale or to facilitate their replication, where would you like to see more consensus and more collaboration, either across the sectors or across parties and ideologies?
I would, this is a personal question now, right? This is my opinion in a sense. I think it's across, ideologies and politics. I think that what we have seen is that we're tearing our society apart based on these tiny little ideas as opposed to recognizing the broad areas of common interests that we share, right? Like there's so many more values that we have in common than don't. And we let the opportunity to be frustrated about one issue drive everything else. You know, I'll drop a super divisive issue, right? That I think is on all of our minds, which is reproductive rights. I think that reproductive rights personally is incredibly important, and thinking about the ways in which we're fighting about that is an important discussion to have. However, it can obscure a lot of other things around which people who may be on opposite sides of that issue like have in common. And so looking for the areas of common ground, even on super divisive issues, I think is critically important if we want to avoid letting like these, you know, chaos agents control, you know, what we end up actually discussing and driving us further into these corners. So I certainly think building bridges across political divides is critically important. And a piece of that, I really do think, is acknowledging that mis and disinformation impacts all of us, right? If there's a lot more, you know, election denial that appears on the right, I think that there are a lot of other topics and areas that appear on the left that are not being quite as often discussed. And so we need to be actually looking for ways to acknowledge and share those on both sides.
Thank you, Cameron. I'm going to go back to questions submitted in advance. And you've actually touched on this several times, but I want to just pull it out a little bit more because it's basic. What simple, actionable steps can we give people who don't check their sources?
I mean, that's not an easy answer, right? I think that the simple, actionable steps would be to check them, right, or to take more seriously. I think that it's one challenge I have observed frequently is if you have someone who believes something that if you check it and you determine it's false, and you go back to them and you say, look, I found Snopes debunked this, they're going to say, but I don't trust Snopes, so it doesn't mean anything, right? So I think you can't hit that problem head on. You have to use the other strategies that I talked about earlier, right? Look at trying to decode a message with someone and say, where did that idea come from? Why is the person who's sharing that message saying that thing? If you've looked and found a source that debunks something, rather than communicating the debunk to them, focus in on the source motivations, focus in on the tactics, and draw attention to those instead of the, you know, factual accuracy or inaccuracy.
Thank you. And Cameron, I just want to check in with you. Are you able to stay a little past one?
I'm here. Yep.
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay, great. I'm going to go back to a question because I think that one of the things that was a hot topic again at National Convention was bringing it back to the local level. And you just gave us some information of how we can go into what the National League is doing. Do you have advice on really drilling down to the local level on local conversations? And I'll just say that here in the city of San Jose, we have almost, I think it's 40% that are foreign born. It is a considerable challenge to reach out to many of our communities and that are underrepresented in city government. So could you talk just a little bit more about really drilling down to the local level, the city local level? Thank you.
So this you know, program that I mentioned earlier, the Civic Listening Corps, that is about engaging at the local level in a couple of ways. But the critical one to think about here is maybe it's the opposite of the advice that I gave earlier, right? It's actually listening to the conversation and paying attention to it. So if you're going to be on social media, for example, even in your local social media, whether that's Facebook or whether it's Nextdoor or you know, whether it's your private group of some kind online, paying attention to the things that people are saying, being vigilant about it, and being you know, aware and critical, not of the people that are saying it, but of the messages that are being that are appearing there. Like, this is something that we need to all actively invest in, right? Like, we need to embrace this idea that it's our responsibility to look at and think about it. And I think when you do that, it gives you the opportunity to have a stronger interaction with the other members of your community, right? So if you take, further steps and you say, I want to actually get trained to look at and decode this, the misleading messages online more, the act of learning about that stuff, if it's something that you're motivated to do, helps you to understand better what things people are saying in their community. A great example is sort of like in the world of COVID-19 vaccines from like a year and a half ago, people were sharing videos on social media that their spot where they got the jab was magnetic, right? This is not true. Just to be clear, the vaccine site does not make your arm magnetic. People were sharing videos about it. And if you were not party to that, social media conversation, you were not aware that those misleading images were being spread, then like it would be hard for you to communicate to folks about that or to engage with your community about it. You'd be sort of outside of, in this case, it wasn't just a joke, but from my perspective, it was. So engaging with and understanding what the folks in your community are actually talking about, what the issues that they're carrying, so that when misleading messages are appearing in those conversations, you're well informed and prepared to have a discourse about them. I think that that's critically important. It's different from ignoring the conversation that's outside of the scope of what you care about.
We have another raised hand here, and so I'm going to try to unmute Ellen Wheeler.
Hi, Ellen.
Ellen, could you?
I see Ellen's question in the chat, actually. It says, please comment on the difficulty of looking for sources other than, quote, your tribe does, and encouraging all of us to be more open to more sources. Unfortunately, Ellen, like this is not a simple problem, right? I would say, because I think about this a lot, I have a person in my family who believes many things that I know not to be true, and that falls in a very different place from me, both in terms of politics and media sources. And so a strategy that I often use, and I'm now speaking from personal experience, is to look for things that actually do align with that person's views that are legitimate, right? So, a really simplistic example is if you've got my former employer, the PBS NewsHour produces information that is intentionally nonpartisan and always attempts to deal with both sides. It creates a really good kind of news source to say, the thing that you're concerned about, here's some, useful and legitimate information that connects to the concern that you have. So looking at ways to share information with others that does align with their views so that they are offered the opportunity themselves to develop trust and faith in sources that you also think are legitimate, like is a useful starting point. But that's a long-term strategy. It's not a simple and quick thing to do. But I don't think that any of these things addressing this problem, right, with less than 60 days or whatever till the election day, it's not necessarily about what happens between now and November. It's about a much longer term strategy, because we're not going to solve these problems before the end of the year. But we need to solve them before the end of the decade to some extent, let's hope.
Thanks for the question, Ellen. And by the way, Ellen was also in person at the Denver National Convention. So she was one of those people listening to conversations representing her local league. So let me go back. I want to make sure we don't miss any questions that we had submitted in advance. How can we catch or notice smart deep fakes?
I'm going to actually punt on this question and say that deep fakes are more a fear-mongering tactic than they are a practical risk. This is not an area that we tackle that much. There are some examples of it in the wild that are harmful, but they're incredibly rare and they're kind of like a red herring, to use a term I've been told not to. Right? They're not the main concern that we have, and so I would not invest a lot of time and energy in focusing on them compared to a lot of the other more fundamental challenges we have.
One of the parts of your program that got a lot of attention and discussion at the national convention also was the concept of do not engage, don't give oxygen to misinformation. And I'm wondering if you could comment just a little bit more on tipping points. I mean, how do you gauge a tipping point? In other words, how do you decide when you need to engage in using the tactics you mentioned?
So I think there are complex ways that organizations that we work with think about this. And there's one way to think about it is if there are two dimensions, right? One dimension is reach of something. How many people are seeing this idea already? And the other one is the harm, right? So if on one corner here, reach and harm are both low, you definitely don't want to engage. And then on the other end, if reach and harm are both high, you definitely want to engage. And so then the tipping point is like in the middle, right? So as you cross in either direction, so very high reach and only moderate harm, or very high harm and only moderate reach, are all categories for that. In our work in general, we think about content nationally, online, that has more than 5 figures of engagement. So that means 10,000 likes, shares, comments, etc. online, like is a place where we start to care about it. When it gets to 6 figures of engagement, it's crossed a threshold, right? So if you think about how many people watch mainstream cable news in any given night, that's in the 1 to 4 million people range, right? So if a piece of misinformation on the internet has crossed that threshold, it's as significant as mainstream broadcast or cable television. Therefore, it's definitely something that is crossed a tipping point. It's tricky depending on the territory. And so you have to think subjectively. If it's a topic that's local to California, like the ballot propositions that we just talked about, like all of that stuff goes down by an order of magnitude, right? Divide by 10 and think about it again, because it matters in this smaller community.
I just want to encourage everyone to either raise your hand or enter your questions into chat. And Cameron's quite good at watching chat, so we'll try to get to all of them. And again, just hearkening back to the message you're delivering to us today and that you delivered to the League. And by the way, we're thrilled you're working with National League on this. Do you have any thoughts? There is a lot of pending legislation, a lot of discussion about what legislation should occur on some of the social media platforms. I acknowledge you're a journalist first and foremost, and have no doubt strong feelings about free speech. Would you comment on, or are you comfortable commenting on where you might see a need for some sort of legislation?
Sure. I think about this a lot. I'm actually hosting a conference next week on this topic, or related to this topic. Far and away, the biggest challenge that we face is with respect to social media platforms and the future regulation of them. It's around transparency, right? And so, without offending anyone on this call who may in fact have family members or themselves work at these big social media companies, the big social media companies operate, in my opinion, in a way that is similar to, because I've reported on this, nuclear reactors, right? Incredibly powerful, incredibly valuable, and incredibly dangerous. And we don't operate nuclear reactors without incredibly strict rules and regulators that live inside of them, and lots of documentation about exactly how they work and all of the ways that they comply to make their products safe or their operations safe. We do not do the same thing in this domain with social media companies, even though this is the place where our discourse now lives, right? Our civic discourse lives online. And so what we need is incredible increases in the kinds of transparency that we have, right? The form and shape of that is complicated, and there are various bills that have already been out there. I'm sure that there will be new ones. There's regulation happening in Europe, both in the UK and in the European Union, around these things that look to demand or require new levels of transparency from these platforms, but that's a critical first step, right? Evaluating how much harm there is on these platforms, evaluating how much risk they pose to us and our discourse, and even worse harms than just our discourse, requires a level of transparency we do not have today. And so I think that the future of accountability starts with transparency.
I hope you'll continue to share information with us about future speaking engagements, because I believe many on this Zoom meeting are very interested in implementing some of the things you're talking about, and we have certainly a league alignment, as I said.
Yep.
And could you just talk a little bit more about what you're doing with National League, and is that
Sure.
filtering down to states, state level leagues? Anyway, go ahead, Cameron.
Yep. So in collaboration with the National League, we developed a Train the Trainer program, which I've given to a number of state league folks in some particular states. So it's sort of like a pilot program with 10 states. However, California is not one of those states. However, I think that we can make all of the resources that we're making available to those states accessible to you. I think I actually already have asked the National League about that, and that's been confirmed, but I'll double check. And in that Train the Trainer program, a slightly expanded version of the presentation that I just gave to you with a detailed script outline is something that I trained the folks that joined the Train the Trainer to how to present it. So how to think about all these issues that we're talking about and how to deliver it. And then we give that to them so that they can then go back into their communities and communicate these same ideas to others. And the point here is to arm people with these basic ideas that we started with at the beginning, right? Here's what this problem is. Here's why it works. Here's who's trying to do it. And then think about, here's why it's your responsibility to tackle this yourself in your community. No one's going to come solve it for you. And then finally, here's the strategies for response, and here's something you can do to take, to actively participate. So that's sort of like a full-on presentation. That's a resource that you can take and go and give and host in other settings, right? Host it at your own library, host it at your own church, wherever, the point of it is, this is nonpartisan. We talk about the issues from both sides. And this is a way of building relationships with folks in your community around an issue that is critical for folks all across the community. So it's kind of a package that you can take. And if you're interested in trying to train others and then recruit them to participate in the effort to combat mis and disinformation.
Thanks, Cameron. And actually, we had a person that was formerly on the call. I think she's dropped off now, named Marianne Shublin. And Marianne also coordinates a civil discourse, a series of civil discourse meetings within our county. And I'm very interested in following up. We also have a state board member on the call. So maybe we can facilitate getting that information out. I'd like to share it with the League of Women Voters at the Bay Area, which represent locals in the 9 counties that touch San Francisco Bay. So I really hope we can get that follow-up information from you. And there are an amazing number of people that have stayed on this call. Normally there's a huge drop off at 1. And then that's a tribute to you are an absolutely intriguing, fascinating speaker. So I'm going to say, folks, this is your chance. Please enter your question right into chat or raise your hand, because this is a really unique opportunity to engage with someone like Cameron. You heard his credentials and they are impressive. Marianne still does appear to be there. Marianne just sent you her email. Marianne, I will follow up and make sure we have Cameron's contact information and follow up with him on a potential another program that has a little bit broader reach. And now if we could go back a little bit, I think the thing that intrigued me the most, and one of the things I heard the most talk about, was the fact that you gave us these very specific tactics I mean,
Mhm.
I can tell you that when you said do not engage, I don't know if you could hear it. There was a gasp in the audience. Did you hear that? I mean, literally, like we all kind of went. All the people around me kind of went, like, how do we do that? And then the program went on. So a question just got into chat. I'm going to check that because I don't want to miss. That's from Marianne. Again, yeah, we're going to follow up on some of the training, because for me, those of you that know me know it's very difficult for me not to engage, to not argue, to not challenge. And I'm really appreciative. Would you just talk just a little bit more about the specific tactics?
The tactics that people use that we need to avoid, or sorry, can you clarify?
Well, actually, come to think of it, let's start with the avoid.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I'm not sure where to go here. Like, I think that I didn't get into all of the specifics in this presentation, but learning about and understanding what logical fallacies are, and what what we really mean when we say false and missing context, really intimately making yourself aware of that can be incredibly enlightening, right? There are dozens and dozens of different things that we call logical fallacies, right? So false equivalence is one, but another one is an appeal to authority. So a great example that we were just looking at earlier today in some of our other work was in Chinese language communities here in the US, there is a news article circulating that says, MIT study says XYZ about COVID vaccine, right? And just by putting MIT in there, it legitimizes what is not really true. Now, I don't know where the MIT association is. I don't actually speak Mandarin, so I couldn't read the article myself. But with the experts that we worked with, they explained the idea, and you can just see, because you can see it right in the headline, that using this concept of an appeal to authority instantly works. There are, and I will share the resources later that include a link to understanding lots and lots of different logical fallacies, but that's not something that is standard, civics education. It's not something that's standard media literacy training, but it is a lot of it is common sense, and it is really useful to think about. So thinking about, here are the ways that people do this on a fine grained detail, and how I should be able to recognize them, because lots of them have telltale signs. You can then become much more capable of resisting the impacts that they have.
We had a specific question on election fraud, and I know that that most of them, campaigns are famous for pivots and half truths, et cetera, et cetera. This question was about verifying information that campaigns put out. That may be a little, if you're comfortable with that question, would you talk a little bit specifically about misinformation, disinformation in campaigns?
So this is a little bit trickier. And in fact, our work, we tend to shy away from the direct efforts to fact check candidates. We don't fact check in general, but our focus is less on the candidates, because that actually is the primary focus of a lot of the fact checking organizations. And so they do that work very well. One of the other unfortunate things is that the social media platforms have a bizarrely, distinct policy about what things that they will make subject to fact checking and other kinds of problems relative to other entities, right? So politicians get this weird pass on social media, which is kind of crazy. So it's a little bit trickier, but I don't think that on the substance, it's not any different, right? I think that the point is, look for the telltale signs of strategies, right? Misdirection, the logical fallacies, the false context, those kinds of things around how candidates, politicians are communicating, and focus on those rather than necessarily the specific substance. I mean, when someone's lying directly and someone else believes them because they're motivated by their alignment with them on their political views, you're not gonna defeat them on the substance, right? So I don't actually think that that's as valuable a strategy, especially when you are on the opposite side of someone else. I think instead drawing attention to like the tactics that they're using to convey their messages is an easier way to sort of, you know, demystify and reduce their power, right?
Actually, we're going to stop the official program right now. Cameron, do you have a little bit more time? You've been so generous with your time.
Yeah, I can do it in about 5 more minutes.
Okay, actually, so I am going to conclude the official program. Thank you profusely once again, and say goodbye to folks. I do want to mention our next lunch with League, which is October 21st. We will have Scott Neese, who's retiring soon as CEO of the San Jose Downtown Association, will share his reflections on San Jose. He's been there since the 1980s, so he's got a lot of past, present, and future to talk about. And of course, we're very busy now with all of our candidate forums, pros and cons presentations prior to the November election. Remember to watch for your voter, and also check our website, lwvsjsc.org, for more information. So now we'll go to a more informal format for another couple